Welcome to the HC Commodities podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're releasing an episode outside of our normal schedule, given the timeliness, on tariffs and metals in particular. What tariffs are in place on metals and in particular critical minerals? What has been the response, particularly from China? What is the underpinning of those tariffs and how does that create uncertainty? What are the goals of them? And what does it mean for contracts? What does it mean for M&A? And what does it mean for markets? Our guest is Guy Winter, partner at Fasken in their global mining group. Guy's also on the advisory board of the Critical Minerals Association in the UK and on the UK's Department of Business and Trade Critical Minerals Expert Committee. He's also an author of fiction books. His latest two were The Billionaire Suicide Club and The Billionaire Suicide Club 2, Red Queen Rising. As always, you can really support the show by leaving a positive review on the platform you're listening on. I also just wanted to highlight Enco Insights, our advisor network for the energy and commodities sector, relevant here in providing expert witnesses to law firms in and around energy and commodity matters, all of which have been heightened by the recent tariffs. And, as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, Guy, welcome to the pod.
Great to be here, Paul.
Yeah, we've done a live panel together, I think, last year, so excited to have you on for, I think, what's going to end up being a bit of an emergency pod, and we'll get it out because it's so timely. But we are indeed talking tariffs, and particularly focusing in on the metal sector and particularly around critical minerals. Before we go too far, can you just help us understand exactly what tariffs are in place and sort of the legislation, the executive orders, the powers given to the presidency that has enabled President Trump to do those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you used the term emergency, Paul, and I think that's spot on. I mean, the way that I would really look at it is that we've been in a critical minerals Cold War since the rare earths embargo imposed on Japan by China in 2010. And what we've really seen now with the Trump tariffs and the very much full metal jacket Chinese response to those is really that war becoming hot. And if you kind of look at the Western heavy rare earths market at the moment, it looks like Archduke Franz Ferdinand after an open-top car ride through Sarajevo. I mean, we really are at that level.
Except lots of Gavrilo Princeps knocking around.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the question is, who's on whose side this time, right? In terms of the regime, I think it's really interesting to look at all of the different parts as they fit together, both on the US side and really importantly on the Chinese side as well. So, you know, for us in our sector, as metals people, the sort of the core thrust is through the 25% tariff on all aluminium, steel, and derivative goods imports into the United States, and also auto parts on top of that. Now, in terms of other metals that are of interest, there are exclusions from the blanket 10% tariffs, which will apply to most of the world where there isn't a special tariff regime. And the exclusions would apply to gold, silver, PGMs, and a bunch of other critical minerals that are considered not to be readily available in the United States. And so the kind of $64 billion question in the market has been, are we going to see tariffs imposed on critical minerals? And I think this comes back to your point about the Section 232 executive order. So essentially, President Trump has issued executive orders launching investigations under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, and to determine whether copper and critical mineral imports impair US national security. And, you know, if you take a step back from that, it's pretty clear that they do. And it's pretty clear from the impact that the Chinese countermeasures have had that the conclusion is going to be that they do have an impact on US national security. So the question then arises, what are you going to do about it? And, so far for President Trump, the answer to every question like that has been tariffs. I think that there are a number of many more effective ways to address the impacts on US national security, but maybe we'll come on to speak to that later in this discussion.
Yeah. Just taking a step back. So, we would just take tariffs more broadly. So you have those that have fallen under kind of the Liberation Day tariffs. These are sort of I think it's the 1972 Emergency Powers Act or something like that, where the president can essentially unilaterally through executive order say, we're under threat. There's a threat over there. Here's the tariffs. And that's where we've got sort of the emergency powers, the IEEPA Act, this Emergency Powers Act that's allowed Trump to essentially, as I understand it, this is correct, circumvent the Section 232, the 232 being, under the Commerce Act, you're able to say, we want a 270-day investigation on these particular products, at which a recommendation is made and the president has 90 days to enact. Those are two, as I understand it, two separate things. So the Emergency Power Acts that sort of supercharged Liberation Day and enabled President Trump to put, or the administration to put, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10% on everyone else, and obviously oodles on China. Are those tariffs are enacted today or not, or some, or most, or what?
So, that's a really interesting aspect of it, Paul, because obviously when the tariffs were announced, those ignored the effect of the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement, which had actually been enacted during President Trump's own first term in office. And so that has been one of the sort of first areas in which there's had to be a kind of rowback to figure out exactly what the legal basis for imposing tariffs of that nature would be. But you're right that essentially what you have is a tariff regime which is based on protection of US national interests around aluminium, steel, and derivative goods. And that took effect immediately. And then the suite of other tariffs, which essentially the big kind of reprieve that the markets had was the pause on those whilst there was further consideration of how they would be applied.
The reason why we immediately got steel and aluminum and derivatives tariffs was essentially piggybacking off a prior 232 from the first Trump administration, similarly with automobile tariffs as well. And then you've got these probes into, I guess, for this, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, but for this discussion, critical minerals, copper, and then, some timber, just to get us all on the right page. With respect to these reciprocal tariffs, these are all on a 90-day pause at this stage.
So since the 5th of April 2025, everyone is paying a 10% baseline tariff on imports into the US. And that is in place under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that you mentioned earlier. There's a pause on all tariffs which exceed the baseline 10%. So the initial list of specific tariffs that were up on the White House board that President Trump held up would all be limited to 10% until such time as that 90 days elapses.
So at the moment, we're sort of immediately dealing with, outside of that 10% broad-based tariff on everyone, with one or two notable exceptions, steel and aluminum, and as you mentioned, derivatives, and then obviously the 232 investigations on rare earths or critical minerals, but copper and aluminum as well. So before we dig into let's start there. What is the expected outcome of those? And also, how do you, this is all sort of assuming a unilateral action, and in some ways assuming that there would be no reciprocal response, particularly from the likes of China, who could make it very immediately a critical issue if they stopped all, as we are seeing, and we'll come on to, just export bans on some of these key materials?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the really interesting aspect, because if you look at what China has done, they imposed a reciprocal tariff of a minimum of 125% on US goods. But more importantly, they have expanded the export restrictions that they had already imposed on certain critical minerals exports onto 7 rare earth elements and magnets that are really critical for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and defense technology. And so it's that which has started to exert significantly more pressure onto the United States. And so what we are now starting to expect is that it, perhaps as President Trump always intended, this will be triggering a sort of series of discussions between the United States and the key counterparties in order to develop trade deals whereby there will be negotiated outcomes in terms of the tariffs that are applied.
Yeah, but it's a huge stick, isn't it? And we've got an episode coming up with Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes sort of talking on the long view on American US critical minerals policy. I mean, the fundamental point here, though, is that, you know, most of these materials, in the case of those heavy rare earths, are almost entirely produced in China. You know, it doesn't really matter where the mine sits, it matters where the processing sits, which, yes, it's dirty, but it also now, you know, the IP that the Chinese have around that is leaps ahead of what is available in the West. Just to be really clear about this, these export controls, are they in place today? Is stuff allowed to flow? And, like, you know, if not, when, kind of thing? I mean, where are we on sort of that particular scale of some going and none going?
Yeah, so I think at the moment where we are is, so this applies to specified heavy rare earth elements, right? So there isn't at this time an export restriction on some of the light rare earth elements. But the important thing is that it also extends to the technology around it. And so we're already seeing a significant impact in terms of the shipments that are being made. It's not an outright ban, but it is an export licensing regime, a mandatory export licensing regime. And the reports from China are that the regime is not actually in place to allow those licenses to be granted. So clearly that is going to create a very, very significant backlog. And I think many Western manufacturers are not expecting that will be in place for months, if not indefinitely. So it is a very, very significant and already impactful measure that China has taken there.
One question before I ask about those impacts, just focusing on those heavy rare earths. Does this just apply to the US? I mean, is China saying to Europe, hey, look, we've got no beef with you, you can have this stuff, and essentially driving a wedge through sort of that sort of historic alliance?
It's very interesting, Paul, because it is an export licensing regime. And so it applies to Europe as well as to the United States. And in actual fact, we understand that it has been even harder under the previous export restrictions that have applied in relation to germanium, gallium, and antimony for European buyers to get access to these materials. So at the moment, there's no reason to count on Europe getting any more favorable treatment. And in fact, you probably will have seen that there has been some reporting from the Chinese state media that discouraging third-party countries, and I guess here they're particularly talking about Europe, from doing their own deals with the United States that might jeopardize China's interests. So it's fairly clear that they intend to use this as a stick against allies of the United States as well as the United States themselves.
And what if, I mean, it's hard to sort of overstate the impact if there's a total export ban for a long period of time, not least because there's just simply no way of finding alternate sources, without having sort of 17 years in the interim to build up the capability.
Yeah.
What impact are we seeing right now, I guess what you're seeing on sort of the M&A side, the transaction side, market side today in those markets which aren't traded markets. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on steel and aluminum.
It's interesting. Obviously, in these types of market conditions where there is severe disruption and lack of clarity, you expect to see a disruption on cargoes moving. Now, I think it's been more focused so far on the Chinese export controls, and I think partly because there was as you know, for a while there's been a lot of discussion about what these tariffs might look like, and so a lot of physical material had already been moving to the US. So a huge amount of physical gold, silver, copper, and PGMs had already gone to the US in anticipation of tariffs being put in place. So there's potentially a huge amount of inventory built up there. And the question might be when it starts to flow back to Europe and other locations. So in terms of the US tariffs, if anything, it's probably stimulated a lot of physical moving in advance of tariffs being imposed. Where there clearly are issues is with cargoes coming out of China in these materials. And there, I think, there are numerous reports of force majeure being called by Chinese exporters. And clearly, that's a scenario where there could be really quite long delays in European and American manufacturers being able to get hold of that material. Now, there are quite significant stockpiles in various parts of the world because, as I referred to the Japanese rare earth crisis of 2010, when China withheld rare earth supplies from Japan in response to a territorial dispute. So in Japan, they have very significant stockpiles that they've built up in response to that. There's a lot of speculation as to how long the stockpiles in the West, though, would be able to survive these sort of export controls over time.
Yeah, and you don't, quantum-wise, I mean, we're not talking huge tonnage here, right? So it is possible to build up reasonable stockpiles on these sort of the rare earth side. What are we seeing? So, you mentioned at the start, with the likes of copper, right? So the US imports 50% of its copper. It sees it as it is no doubt a strategic critical mineral for all variety of reasons, not least the amount of infrastructure, grid infrastructure that needs to be replaced in the US over the coming decade. I guess I don't really understand, and I'm not necessarily asking you to understand either, but they come down and they put tariffs on copper. There isn't sufficient capacity in the US to meet that 50% gap. So I'm just sort of trying to understand sort of what tariffs actually achieve in your, I know traditional McKinley tariffs, we're going to support a nascent industry, but it takes a long time and there's not much evidence they actually work after you protected a very nascent sort of startup. So what happens with copper? We guess, I don't know how many days we've got left on the 270, but, let's say 170 left.
Yeah. Well, if you look at copper, that's a really interesting metal. Obviously, there's a long-term demand curve for that because of the electrification of so many aspects of energy and transport and the environmental drivers towards electrification. But at the moment, the copper price isn't really sending signals to incentivize massive development of new copper projects. Moreover, in the United States in particular, although there are good copper prospects and there are projects in Arizona, for example, it's proved very, very difficult to bring these mines into construction. So I guess that from President Trump's perspective, he will be saying that a combination of expediting the permitting process and creating a price stimulus for people to buy American copper will incentivize people to go out and build mines quickly and capturing those jobs and revenue within the United States. And he possibly isn't quite so focused on the timeline of, permitting to mine production that people in the industry would. I think perhaps critics of that theory would say, just as you said, Paul, are tariffs really the best way to achieve this? And so, for example, if they really want to encourage production of copper in the United States, they might be better to look at alternative measures like, for example, providing a floor price for copper that's produced in the United States to give people the certainty that they can make those significant investments. And then if you were to accompany that with more streamlined permitting provisions, you might be in a situation where you're starting to restart the US copper mining industry in some meaningful way. The issue that we've obviously seen is that essentially the tariffs are a relatively kind of shock treatment for deglobalization. And there's going to be very severe pains for people along the way, whilst American industry catches up and the rest of the world gets used to those tariff barriers.
And this is the sort of the fundamental challenge is, in order for them to work, people have to believe that they're going to be there for the very long term, and those timelines match up with whatever you can do on federal permitting. You've still got state and local, and you've still got, it takes a long time, we're talking decades to stand these things up. But there's this sense at the moment you've got two layers of timelines on this. One is obviously a potential midterm coming up in now a year and a half or whatever before, or probably tomorrow before we start getting letters through our letter boxes about which candidate we should vote for. So you've got that, and there's obviously Congress actually holds the power over tariffs, and ultimately, and then you've got the other next level of timeline, which is, and this is where sort of these countervailing narratives come up, which is, this is all sort of just a bringing people to the table exercise. And in that case, then actually most of these aren't expected to stay on. Certainly the sort of broad sweeping reciprocal tariffs. You've already got the response from especially the likes of China, which is a big stick. Do you, when you're talking to your clients, is there sort of the general sense that actually this can't stand, and even if it could, for the next 2 years, we will just be in stasis, rather we're not going to commit to any kind of actual investments?
It's obviously been a really key part of the president's approach to try to continue retrading, to create a sort of a state of uncertainty, a fluid situation where if people respond, then he has retained the flexibility to make a counter response. And so you've obviously seen this sort of iterative approach to this tariff exercise, which clearly has given many commentators to believe that it is essentially a gambit to get people to negotiate deals on favorable terms to the United States. But the secret of that strategy is that you can't be quite sure, can you? And the consequences are so grave that, in a sense, you do have to consider all of the options. And that really is probably what has given people the most difficulty in responding to this. There have been some signs that the strength of the Chinese response has already caused the administration to indicate that its end game may be some sort of negotiated trade deal. Let's hope that's the case, because otherwise, as you say, we are set for a very long period of uncertainty. And really, that kind of uncertainty is precisely what undermines the type of investment.
The whole goal. Yeah, exactly. If, no one's going to invest in. I mean, and in fairness to President Trump, I mean, it's put at center stage just how reliant the West is on these critical mineral value chains, something that we've covered in this pod for 5 years now, and highlighted by our mutual friend Simon Moores to Congress multiple times. And I think your recent post about the F-35, right? it literally has components that only come from China, which isn't particularly useful if you're in a difficult situation one day, God forbid. But that is sort of the challenge, is that actually the timelines just don't overlap, but it is obviously a real issue that's been highlighted.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
So we're talking today, you mentioned it, I'm just sort of from a legal standpoint.
Yeah.
Are we talking force majeure level stuff here? I mean, or is that going to be heavily debated in the courts as to whether a change in tariff regime, or let's just understand that if people are doing transactions today and suddenly all of the economics are upside down because your steels cost 25% more.
Yeah, so it's pretty well established under English law that a change in economic or market circumstances which affects the profitability of a contract or the ease with which it can be performed is not force majeure in the legal sense. And so from that point of view, with the tariffs, you're going to see force majeure called, but, very often that's a negotiating position where one party is indicating that it would like to retrade in some way. So in terms of the Trump tariffs, those don't look like force majeure events as such. It's important to qualify that by saying that force majeure is a creature of contract, right? So you're always going to be construing the way that it is drafted, but that there's not going to be a huge amount of sympathy from the courts just because the deal got worse as a result of an event like tariffs. Now, one thing, Paul, that is quite interesting is that in the asymmetrical nature of tariffs as opposed to export restrictions, because an export restriction does look a lot more like a force majeure event.
Yeah, the actual product can't flow.
Exactly. And so you're in a situation where if you think about what force majeure is, it is circumstances out with the control and foresight of the parties at the time they contracted. So if you're a Chinese exporter and your government has imposed an export regime without a clear route to how you actually get the licenses, indeed possibly an expectation that you won't get them if you're planning to ship it to the United States, to a defense contractor, then that looks a lot like a force majeure event. And so I'd expect that to be the type of scenario that is much more easily enforceable. Now, the other thing that we're also discussing with our clients is clearly in an M&A context, and you touched upon this earlier, actually, that you will typically, especially in North American M&A, have a material adverse effect out from the transaction. And in that situation, the imposition of a new regime, whether it's tariffs or export restrictions, that's going to require very careful examination, because you can easily imagine that deals that looked a lot more appealing in a pre-tariff or pre-export restriction world are going to look a lot more difficult. And as we move forward, unless we get into a period of certainty again, there's going to be that constant risk. So I'd expect that, my colleagues and I will be pretty busy in looking at the drafting of these clauses with that specific thought in mind. How do we draft to protect our clients from that scenario?
Once the sort of the genie's out of the bottle, right, in terms of this being a potentially a foreseeable and a non-trivial potential in any commercial transaction or M&A transaction, suddenly you're going to need a lot more language, thought and support around any of these transactions. So essentially, irrespective of whatever, no tariff even gets actually enacted or they all get rolled back, ultimately it's kind of inflationary across the board, right? I mean, in terms of people now pricing in these risks and actually not just pricing them in, but also needing highly competent and expert lawyers in the field to actually support and maintain these transactions, right? I mean, it's suddenly become a lot more, expensive even were no tariff in place, to achieve kind of these ultimate goals as well around actually creating a commercial reason for these critical minerals, for these heavy industries to return to the West.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the one thing I can guarantee you is that we're going to get some really interesting case law coming out of this period. Now, that's interesting for us, but to guys on the ground, that is cost, that is delay, that's, distraction from management time.
I'll plug our Enco Insights business that provides expert witnesses to the legal community from in the energy and commodities world. So I'm sure they might be a little bit more busy, and it's been, frankly, as well. I mean, it's been a busy last 6 years, right? With the initial roll of tariffs, then obviously COVID, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we saw particularly around the demand we're seeing at the moment for expert witnesses in and around LNG as all those contracts suddenly faced a different regime. And, it's just remarkable how much the world has changed from sort of that free trade Nirvana-like moment somewhere in sort of 2000 or something, right, to today, and the velocity of those changes and just how central actually the commodities world is to that. And it's quite remarkable as well that actually, I think if we were back 10 years ago and there was discussion around critical minerals and export controls and tariffs, it probably wouldn't have made the newspaper to the same extent that it does today, right? The public awareness of this as a key issue is certainly there, and that's what we're seeing legislators respond to.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the things that, possibly in the interest of balance we should be clear about is that tariffs, I personally am not a believer that tariffs are the right tool for the objectives that President Trump has. But I do agree with him that there are a number of issues that should be resolved. And as you said earlier, over-dependence on China for these materials is absolutely one of those. And it isn't sustainable. As to whether tariffs were the right way to address it, that's another question. But we're going to have to find solutions to these issues, because otherwise what we've seen is that wherever there is a kind of geopolitical conflict, this is going to be a big stick to beat the West with.
And surely that solution lies somewhere in partnerships, because these raw materials are scattered around the world. There's different countries have different, mineral deposits, have different processing capabilities, different willingness to process those materials. And this is kind of where, again, we sort of see this, actually you'd imagine that there'd be even stronger partnerships with Canada and Mexico in the context of critical minerals, partnering with Denmark, and we don't need to get into the politics of it. But I guess the fundamental point is that, and that's kind of what's caught people a little, even despite the fact that these were well telegraphed. I mean, then there's a question for you. These were well telegraphed in the presidential race. Has it still caught people by surprise, or have you seen people thinking about this from a commercial contract for some time?
I think people have been surprised by how quickly and how aggressively the tariff regime has been imposed. I think that people had expected that it would be trailed for longer, that there would be more opportunity to do trade deals in advance. And so to have tariffs of this level imposed, and to have them imposed on friendly nations like Canada, Mexico, the European Union, in this way with so little prior consultation, I think that has very much caught markets by surprise. And I think we've probably seen that in the way that the equity markets and bond markets and metals markets have received all of this news.
You're advising clients today about what might happen in the future, which now has become even a difficult challenge, and it always was. But
yeah,
so I guess there's sort of this look to see what happens in this 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs as an indication of kind of where the administration is starting to stand on this, and its, I guess, political will to continue pushing them through. The next big milestone would be somewhere around 170 days from now. It's around the 100th day of the administration, on what the recommendations are from the Commerce Department, if I'm getting that right, around particularly, I guess, copper is sort of, being the big one. Is there what are people doing today to anticipation of that? And when do we start hearing about, what the possible focus on copper might be?
It will be really interesting to see the deals that are done. So I think people will be watching out for the first trade deals that the United States announces, because I think that is going to give quite an important indication to what the real priorities are that are underlying this whole exercise. I think there's a hope in the market that the impact on copper, for example, will be relatively limited. When it comes to critical minerals, you really are looking at the potential for quite significant escalation with China there. So, for example, it was announced by MP Materials, who run the Mountain Pass light rare earth project in the United States, that they will not be exporting their ore to China for processing because of the export restrictions and the tariffs that China has imposed on the United States. So there you've got a reciprocal export control being imposed in the United States. That's a very, very quickly escalating scenario around rare earths. So I think that what I'd expect is that they'll be looking to put some of these trade agreements in place before showing their hand a lot on some of these specific materials. And so the desire will be to try and reach accommodation with China rather than escalating matters further there.
Pick the wrong one there, really, because obviously in a negotiation, it doesn't do as much pain to China as it certainly does to the rest of the world when it comes to export controls of these critical minerals, right? It only strengthens their industry. Just, I guess, and you also sit with the, as an expert advisor to the UK's Department of Business and Trade, like, without sharing obviously any state secrets, but kind of what is the mood? Because Europe's in a difficult situation here in that it's being tarred with the same brush as by China in terms of the US, but it also doesn't have the resources. It doesn't have the mineral wealth. It's how you understand the UK, particularly being outside of Europe now, isn't particularly helpful either. How are the UK government viewing this, and what sort of preparations are they undertaking?
Yeah, so you may recall that the UK's critical minerals strategy came out a couple of years ago, and that is something that the government has proactively been looking at rebooting. In actual fact, as shocking as the sort of Trump tariff situation has been, in many ways, a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the critical minerals world have already been anticipated for some time. That's not the same as being solved for, because
it's looked at very closely.
Yeah, exactly. I think the UK had already been working hard at putting into place some of the partnerships that will be needed to navigate through the constraints, the supply chain constraints that could apply. I think perhaps one of the most stark challenges that recent events have thrown up is really exactly how there was a kind of assumption that the West would operate in some sort of concerted way to build ex-China supply chains. The advent of American exceptionalism through some of President Trump's early executive orders obviously cast a bit of doubt on that, Paul. And so, what you've seen is Canada, for example, where, this firm is headquartered. And, they've clearly been treated aggressively by the United States and have started to look at diversifying the alliances that they have in critical minerals. So from a UK perspective, that probably provides both opportunities and challenges. Certainly, both Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Starmer have been at pains to meet together, to spend time together, to work towards closer links between the UK and Canada. That's immensely beneficial in critical minerals terms, given the wealth that Canada has. But look, we can't deceive ourselves that it's harder to do these things if we're not completely in kilter with the United States.
Well, really appreciated having you on. I think just to give us a decent update on what's going on. And I think the major point is we're still in a massive period of uncertainty. Let's hope that there's a scale down across the board from, a commodities flowing around the world perspective. But I think as highlighted here that suddenly this is something that no longer can be assumed as not going to happen, and from a commercial transaction standpoint, need the good offices of yourself and Fasken and others to help navigate.
Well, we'll do our best, Paul. But as you say, ultimately there is a period of adjustment that we'll all have to go through. I mean, I guess in terms of to sound a note of optimism, we have had, as you referred to, some recent very disruptive events in critical minerals, the nickel crisis of 2022. And there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from that in terms of how you navigate through these issues and the flexibility that supply chains and OEMs have shown in order to re-engineer, to find alternative sources and to work together with friendly countries. I suppose that one of the kind of shocking aspects of this has been the fact that it was the United States that initiated this immediate crisis that we look at in critical minerals, whereas in the past, we've probably been more shoulder to shoulder in addressing it.
Yeah, and the other thing just to say as well is that with the likes of copper and aluminum, you've got sort of vibrant markets that are very responsive and send out price signals. You just don't, you don't have that in many of these rare earths. So there's not the same capacity for response and for essentially the stuff flowing. So it's a clarion call for ever more sort of open commodity markets and functioning free markets. But yeah, well, Guy, always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.